We are on day number 25 of World Carnivore Month. And when I say we, I'm talking about myself and maybe the 2 or 3 people that are watching this actual video. But these guys over here, these guys are the real savages. They've been doing this carnivore stuff for a while. And you guys have a lot of concerns about your cholesterol. And I actually think that that's great. I think that you should be concerned about your health, and it's good to ask questions, and it's good to be able to formulate good questions. But I think the cholesterol thing has been really beaten to death, and there may be some myths about it or some misunderstandings about it. Maybe it is a good marker for health, maybe it isn't, but I'm not an expert. I don't research this stuff like these guys do. These guys are looking into this stuff daily. They're communicating with the top people in the world multiple times every single day, and they have been for the last several years. So let's kind of open this up a little bit. I'm also going to share some of my labs with you guys, but let's kind of open this up. You know, what do you guys feel is kind of the most misunderstood thing about cholesterol?
The whole cholesterol equation has mainly been LDL centric for so many years. So when we're talking about cholesterol, we're talking about serum cholesterol, which is a measure of all the cholesterol in the bloodstream, which is distributed among multiple particles. And I saw something really great on Instagram recently. Somebody asked another doctor, will a ketogenic diet, presumably like a carnivore diet, raise my bad cholesterol? And the response was priceless. He said, you don't have bad cholesterol, you have bad information. And I think it's totally true. What we know is that LDL serves vital roles in the human body, moving triglycerides and cholesterol around the body. Cholesterol is actually a steroid backbone molecule that is a precursor for all of our steroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, things that make us...
My ears perked up.
Right? Things that are important for us to know about, right? Things that are important for us to have. So, and what we also know is that LDL, this so-called bad cholesterol, serves vital roles in the human body in an immunologic role. When we deplete cholesterol, or specifically when we deplete LDL from the body, we are more susceptible to infections. There's a genetic condition called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, in which there's a defect in the synthesis pathway for cholesterol. This is called the mevalonate pathway. And those people suffer from pretty serious infections. We've seen the same thing in mouse models. We deplete cholesterol, we deplete LDL, they get more sick, they die sooner when they're injected with pathogens. When they have higher levels of LDL, they're more resistant to pathogens. So the whole story around LDL is kind of demonizing it as a bad cholesterol because it kind of gets roped into this atherosclerotic plaque. But it actually has vital roles in the human body. And what I've seen so much as I've looked at all these LDL levels that rise on ketogenic diets, pretty predictably, probably because the synthesis of ketones and the synthesis of cholesterol share a common pathway. They're kind of connected. They're like an off-ramp in the mevalonate pathway. So when you are in a ketogenic diet, and certainly different fats in the diet can change LDL levels as well, the LDL may rise. But is this really a problem? And I think what is very clear, if you look at the data, is that it's all contextual and it can't be interpreted in a vacuum. We have to know what insulin sensitivity levels are. And when we break down the data, when you actually look at data regarding LDL levels and cardiovascular disease, and you stratify that by insulin sensitivity, you see a very different story. Wow. People that are insulin sensitive, and there are a number of ways that we can determine that.
People that are maybe heading down the road of potentially being pre-diabetic or something like that.
That would be insulin resistance.
Got it.
Right?
Okay.
So people that are insulin sensitive, if they have a high HDL or a good triglyceride to HDL ratio of 1 or less-ish, those people don't seem to have any correlation between levels of LDL and heart disease. So we have to interpret LDL in this context, but most physicians aren't taught this, and most people think about it in a vacuum, and they think about it in a myopic perspective, only looking at LDL and not looking at the whole picture, that insulin sensitivity picture, which expands to fasting insulin, C-peptide, HSCRP, triglyceride HDL ratio. When you look at it that way, things become much more clear into how we should worry about LDL or not.
Yeah, I'll just sort of echo what Paul says, but kind of talk about it in a little different light. So the majority of Americans unfortunately fall into this metabolically unhealthy pattern. And so for the average physician, they're going to look at an elevated LDL and say, well, you're in the majority group. So the easy answer is, and the lazy answer is, we'll just throw you on a statin and tell you you're on a low fat diet. And I think that probably helps some people slightly. I mean, certainly cholesterol does have a role, despite the fact that it has many good roles that Paul pointed out. But it does have a role in building that atherosclerotic plaque. Now, it's like, I liken this to building a fire. You have to have wood, you have to have fuel, which is oxygen, and you have to have a spark. If you don't have all three of those there, and we can use cholesterol as the analogy as being wood, without the spark, without the oxygen, it's not going to do anything. So it's the same thing. You've got to have the right environmental environment or milieu, and so we have so many people that are, again, in the wrong position. Now, what Paul is saying is very likely true, that when we take out those risk factors and we have people with very good triglyceride ratios like you have on your labs and I have, and I'm sure Paul has, we're at much less risk for cardiovascular disease despite potentially elevated cholesterol. Now, to say that we have good data, long-term studies on that, yet we don't actually have that data yet. So it's still a little bit of, we've got to get more data to say that, but I think it's becoming more and more accepted, particularly in the low carb community, that is likely what's going on. And fortunately, those studies are starting to happen, and we'll have data probably within the next year or two, I think. Paul, are you aware of anything else beyond that?
Well, you've got Framingham data. You can stratify the Framingham data by HDL and see a very different picture than you do if you do it just by LDL. So you can take any of the epidemiology studies that correlate LDL levels and cardiovascular disease and stratify by some metric, which gives you a sense of insulin sensitivity, and see the very different picture emerge, whether it's NHANES data or Framingham data, things like that. It's totally different. So in the Framingham data specifically, if you consider the entirety of the data, there is a correlation between LDL levels and the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And of course, this is epidemiology data. But if you then stratify that data by HDL, and you have an HDL line, which is 45, 55, 65, and 85, what you see is a very different story. In the 85 group, in the HDL of 85 or 65, there's almost no correlation between LDL and cardiovascular disease. So at least in terms of fairly long-term epidemiology studies, we do see differences in LDL connections with incidence of coronary artery disease when we stratify by insulin sensitivity. So it's contextual. And I think that it gets a little bit granular when we talk about this, but what appears to be going on, and I don't think anyone fully understands this pathology, but LDL moves through the endothelium, which is coated by this fimbria layer of glycocalyx, into the subendothelial space, which is the intima. And it appears that only some of the LDL gets stuck there. When LDL gets stuck there, it becomes oxidized, and that may lead to the beginning of an atherosclerotic plaque. But it looks like a lot of LDL is always moving in and out. We have trillions. We actually have a quintillion particles, 10 to the 18th particles of LDL in our body. And we even have more HDL than that. And they're moving in and out of that vascular space, that intramuscular space in the artery wall all the time. And it's only the particles that get stuck that can lead to atherosclerosis. And what makes them sticky? Insulin resistance seems to increase the stickiness, quote unquote, of the LDL layer, of the LDL molecule, and of the proteoglycan layer, which is just below the endothelium and the vessel wall. And we don't necessarily get insulin resistance from eating a low carb diet, right? It's usually an influence of overeating, right? And maybe perhaps carbohydrates. What are your thoughts on that? So there's a couple of things that can cause insulin resistance. It's pretty fascinating. So it can be overconsumption of mixed macronutrients. So mixing fat and carbohydrates, if you overconsume calories as a combination of fat and carbohydrates, we can become insulin resistant. We kind of stuff the adipocyte full, so the fat cells get overfull. And I think insulin resistance for most people starts in the fat cell, and then the fat cell sends out signals to the body, which make the liver and the muscles resistant to the actions of insulin. But generally speaking, low carbohydrate diets do not make people insulin sensitive. They make people very insulin sensitive, not insulin resistant. Right. There's some confusion around a term called physiologic insulin resistance, which really should be glucose sparing. I don't know if we have to get quite this granular. That's a normal phenomenon that happens when we eat a low carbohydrate, whereby the muscle refuses glucose. But what we're really worried about in that situation, we're not worried about anything, because in that situation, insulin is low and serum levels of glucose are low. In type 2 diabetes and true pathological systemic insulin resistance, we see high levels of insulin and high levels of glucose. And that's a very different state that is usually begun by overstuffing the adipocyte, the fat cell, when we're over-consuming calories in the form of carbohydrates and fat together. There are plenty of feeding studies that we can overfeed carbohydrates. In the absence of fat, we don't become insulin resistant. But if you add fat, insulin resistant almost immediately. It's just a physiologic mechanism by which the fat cell says, hey, I don't want any more. The other thing we know is that inflammation in the body can make us insulin resistant sooner. If we inject fragments of bacterial cell walls, specifically lipopolysaccharide, into people, they become insulin resistant sooner. The adipocyte has less of a threshold. And there's also a genetic basis with some people being able to make their adipocytes bigger, being able to get fatter before the adipocyte says, whoa, and becomes insulin resistant. And other people become insulin resistant much quicker. So for instance, Caucasians can become really fat before they become insulin resistant at the level of the adipocyte. And Asians get insulin resistance even when they look skinny. So there's genetic variation, but it usually starts at the level of the adipocyte. It generally has to do with a combination of systemic inflammation and overfeeding of carbohydrates and fat, meaning overconsumption of those calories together, which is usually processed junk food.
Yeah, one thing I'll add is there's sort of a thing that's being put around by some of the plant-based advocates that things like saturated fat in the blood will lead to insulin resistance. And the thing that's left out conveniently, and Professor Ben Bickman has pointed this out with some of the research, he's actually one of the original researchers that actually found this phenomenon. The fact was that while it's true that saturated fat in the blood can lead to that, the problem is saturated fat in the blood does not come from when we ingest it. It comes from the liver making it, and usually that's done under the influence of insulin. And so, again, we get half the story, and when you get the whole story, you find out that we're not quite being told the whole package. So that's another interesting thing.
Should we not be too concerned with? I mean, the average person. I think here's what's kind of going on. The doctor, wants to give them they want to get blood work done, right? The person wants to get blood work done, and usually it's just like a cholesterol test, or maybe cholesterol and triglycerides, and they're not really examining kind of the full picture. And it's probably a giant waste of time. And the doctor, if you do get the test, all he can probably do is be alarmed because he doesn't maybe have the knowledge base of some of you guys and some of the other people out there that are studying nutrition and studying this, on a daily basis. And so therefore, they get to be in this kind of like weird situation. So let's say, somebody needs to get blood work done for insurance purposes, or they need to get blood work done for something specific. What would you guys suggest that they get tested, without this blood work, costing a fortune? If you had to pick, 4 or 5 things to get tested, is there a good list that we can just kind of make sure, like, hey, yeah, you know what, dude, you're relatively healthy?
I think adding a fasting insulin makes all the difference, right? So adding a fasting insulin and a C-peptide. C-peptide is a fragment of insulin, and it's much more stable minute to minute than fasting insulin. But I think if people want to get a lipid panel, you have to have the doctor look at the triglycerides and the HDL ratio. That's already in there. You got to get a fasting insulin, get a C-peptide, get an HSCRP. You're on your way. It wouldn't hurt. That's a pretty good start, and if people want to get other labs, there's further you can go down the rabbit hole, but just adding a fasting insulin, C-peptide, HSCRP to a lipid panel helps give a lot more context here.
Yeah. And I think, and I like Paul put in the C-peptide, because that's when insulin is formed, there's a C-peptide just cleaved off. And so you get that, and fasting insulin will have some variability. So it's not as reliable as you might think it is. I do agree that triglyceride HDL ratio is probably, of the things you can look at on that basic lipid panel, is probably the most useful. And again, there is, even within that, there's some room for uncertainty there, but it seems to be more useful. And most even lipidologists have sort of gone away from looking at plain old LDL and total cholesterol. It's much more complicated and nuanced, even in the folks that are pro LDL centric, causing atherosclerosis. And so, I think the inflammatory marker that Paul pointed out, the HSCRP, it's an acute phase reactant. As you probably know, it can be impacted by a lot of things. If it's low and really low, that's great. I mean, that's generally a good time. It could be high for reasons such as I recently exercised.
I've had mine jacked through the roof.
I had a cold or something like that. So you have to realize that these things can be very dynamically variable. And if we get a reading that's unexpected, we have to say, well, what's going on clinically? Is there a reason for that? And could it be chronic disease, or can it be I worked out hard or something like that? So that's something to be aware of when we're getting these labs.
So should people be concerned whether they want to throw an extra thing of butter, on their steak, or if they want to, is dietary cholesterol causing a problem, or is it mainly just for the people that are maybe they don't have a diet that they're on, and maybe that's what we're seeing being part of the problem, is that they're the standard American, like if you're on the standard American diet, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe if you're on the standard American diet and you really struggle with foods, maybe you should be paying a little bit of attention to how much fat you're eating, and maybe you should kind of watch out how much cholesterol you're eating. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, USDA basically in the last dietary guidelines, I think even the ones before that, basically said cholesterol really wasn't a nutrient of concern when it comes to disease. So, but I would say, and Paul brought this up earlier, when you're combining a bunch of carbohydrates, particularly processed carbohydrates, and you're lumping fat into that is a problem. So the problem is its context. If you've got the standard American dieter that's got a big stack of pancakes and syrup, and he's throwing mounds and mounds of butter on that, that's probably not a good idea. Again, it's very context dependent. And this, I think you're going to see this recurring over and over again. It's context, it's nuance, depends on the circumstance. I think there's some clearly bad things that we would all agree on, and then there's stuff where some people would have differences of opinion. But I mean, clearly we're all saying stay away from the processed junk.
Yeah, I want to point out too that we're not necessarily talking about, having a sweet potato with dinner and throwing some butter on it. It's the aggravation of doing it all the time and constantly insulting what the body is made to handle, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's overfeeding, and it's overfeeding of mixed macronutrients.
And overfeeding like 1 or 2 days, not a huge deal. Having a cheat day, probably not too problematic, but doing it all the time and having real trouble gaining control over your nutrition is probably very problematic.
And that's problematic, and I don't think that'll come as a surprise to many people, and that's what processed foods do, right? They make you overeat fat and carbohydrates together, which is uniquely bad for human physiology. So I think that if somebody's on, a standard American diet, the problem is not necessarily the butter, it's the insulin resistance. And where is the insulin resistance coming from? Well, it can come from a couple of spots, as we talked about. But yeah, they need to be more cognizant of overall calories, more cognizant of quality of food, more cognizant of macronutrient ratios. All of those can be beneficial. But I think that it's totally possible to become quite insulin sensitive eating a ton of carbohydrates, as long as you don't eat it with a ton of fat, especially if it's not processed.
You guys are both amazing, and I feel blessed to have met you, both of you guys. You guys have had such a huge impact, and it's been really cool to have you guys on my podcast, and it's been awesome to learn from you guys. And I feel amazing that I can just I feel very fortunate. I can just text you guys and say, hey, should I take some B vitamins? Like I might just randomly ask you some stupid questions. Hey, can I throw in some carbs into some of this mix? Within this diet. Can people start to kind of mix things in? Or I know that you guys don't, because you feel good all the time. And I think you guys are feeling almost like better all the time, which is pretty cool, because that's been going on for a really long time. Do you think people could mix in some other things here and there?
Yeah, I'll put this in. And I don't think that glucose necessarily is an evil molecule. I mean, we make it. We have it. We have to have it. We have strongly tremendous capacity to make glucose through gluconeogenesis from lactate, from glycerol, from fat, from amino acids. And so I don't see glucose necessarily as the enemy, again, in context. And if you're an insulin sensitive lean athlete and you want to use that for performance, now I think what I see is glucose can be helpful in that situation. Fat is obviously another source of fuel. I think when we look at what does that glucose come with, and this is where we kind of get into the carnivore diet. We have plants that have, chemicals and things that are irritating to the body. They may be toxic in small doses. They may be conditionally beneficial in certain cases, but the glucose molecule itself, I don't have a problem with. And so I'm like, if you want to add something that you tolerate well and it helps you with performance, again, this is in the context of an athlete, eventually, you just got to kind of do what works for you. And I think what I'm dogmatic about is not this is how you have to do something. It's dogmatically find out what's working for you. And I think that's the way we should be. It's like, we can eat for a lot of reasons, and a lot of us do. I mean, we eat for socialization, entertainment, comfort,
fuel being last probably for a lot of people.
Fuel nutrition is, other than athletes that think about this, most of us eat just because, it tastes good and we're being told and marketed to. And so I think if you're mindful about it, and one thing, and I think Paul and I both agree that the carnivore diet is a really good baseline, however you want to implement it. It really gets you, I think, almost back to baseline health as a human. And then you can kind of see what's my tolerance. And I think the modern food environment has made people more susceptible. They tolerate less and less foods. We're seeing things like irritable bowel syndrome, where it's now like 20% of the American populace. And if you look at the Mexican populace, it's like 40%. And it's just going up and up and up. And so something is damaging our gut permeability, our gut, tolerance. And it's probably this combination of the chemically laden, and processed food is kind of a nebulous term, but we all kind of know what it means. It's like pornography. You know it when you see it, right? Mm-hmm. You can't really necessarily define it, right? So yeah. So that's my thought on that.
I think it's pretty interesting, the question of carbs. I don't have a problem with people adding carbohydrates back in. I would consider some spectrum of plant toxicity. So one of the things about a carnivore diet that I think is interesting is imagining or realizing that the majority of our nutrients, the majority of our bioavailable nutrients as humans come from animal foods. And if we do that first and foremost, and then we eat plants on a spectrum of plant toxicity, considering which plants might be more or less toxic, I think we're going to be in a good space. one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is performance on a carnivore diet without carbohydrates. And I had a conversation with Stan Efferding about this and have since been thinking about it. As far as I can tell about, regarding athletic performance, I think if your glycogen stores are full and you have adequate creatine in your muscles, I'm not sure that carbohydrates are necessarily beneficial. What we know is that insulin is not anabolic. It's anti-catabolic. And so spiking your insulin with carbohydrates probably isn't going to result in extra muscle growth. Carbohydrates are not necessarily associated in controlled studies with increase in strength. So I think the jury's still out here, but I think that if we fill our glycogen stores by getting enough protein, and there are studies to show this, like the FASTER study, they ate one.
I just want to interrupt you just for a second, just because some of the people listening right now might be like, bullshit, bro, you need carbs. They're really stuck on that. And what I would like to point out to people is that, and Dr. Baker has mentioned this, and you've mentioned, we've all talked about this before. It's hard to eat enough meat to even know, really. And so that's where I think carbohydrates can come in really handy, because, like as Stan Efferding has, he's got this monster mash. He's got the, kind of mixing in some rice. And why does he have rice? Because he wants to have some influence of, over insulin levels, so he can actually keep you hungry, so you can continue to feed the body, because in some cases, some people are trying to get big and they might be trying to slap on some muscle mass.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at like research coming out of guys like Stu Phillips, Don Lehman, these are the guys, the muscle protein synthesis guys. These are the world-class guys that know this stuff. And they'll tell you what it takes to build muscle is adequate amino acids, particularly leucine, and then secondary arginine, but mostly leucine. You're going to clearly get that on animal products. You got to do the training, we all got to put the work in, and then largely a caloric surplus. I mean, there's some people that say you can do it in a deficit, but that you got to really be busting your ass, and I mean, it's not practical for most people. So the problem I find in the carnivore diet, for some people, and me included, is the caloric surplus part can be hard, particularly from just getting it from meat. Right. And so I think that is, and as we all know, that you can easily overeat carbs and you don't get the same feedback satiety mechanisms like you do with meat. That's why the carnivore diet is so effective for people losing weight, getting lean. Most of these guys, we see them, if you're working out, you're going to get lean, you're going to get a six pack in a lot of cases. But having that, carbohydrate in there, again, you got to find a source that doesn't irritate your guts, that you don't react to, that you tolerate. That may be the advantage there. And it's not necessarily like Paul pointed out, you get enough of an insulin bump from protein that further insulin from carbohydrate does not have any greater effect on muscle protein synthesis. That's what the literature shows. Now, again, you can get your pump on, and a lot of people talk about that. That's probably due to the influence of insulin on the kidneys and handling sodium and water. So you retain fluid, your muscles fill up, and so you can kind of hack that system by taking in fluid and salt in directly prior to working out. And so there's ways to make this work, without the carbohydrates. But again, if you dogmatically want to do that, and you want to really eat, because it might take 5-6 pounds of meat a day for some guys, and that's sometimes hard to do.
Right.
I mean, in the FASTER study, like I was saying, they did 2.1 grams of protein per kilogram, which is about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. They saw equal levels of glycogen storage, repletion, and replenishment in ketogenic athletes and low.
And a lot of times, your blood sugar is similar, right? Obviously, like if someone just had 400 grams of carbs, it wouldn't be similar, but resting glucose in the morning amongst two people that are healthy, even somebody on a low carb diet versus somebody who's eating some carbohydrates, it might be kind of similar, right?
It could be similar depending on their overall insulin tolerance, but one of the things that you said will not be similar is their postprandial glucose. What we know is those mean amplitude glucose.
After the meal, right?
Yeah, those mean amplitude glucose excursions are probably some of the most damaging to the endothelium, to the kidneys, to everything. And so though the fasting glucose might be similar, looking at the blood glucose throughout the day can give us indications, which is why something like a continuous blood glucose monitor is so helpful. What we know, and if we're thinking about the endothelium and back to atherosclerosis, is that, like I said, these postprandial glucose spikes appear to damage the endothelium. So if you spike your blood sugar after a meal, and it's felt to be, anything more than 40 milligrams per deciliter that lasts for more than a few hours after a meal is potentially causing damage. And that's going to be different in somebody that's eating carbohydrates versus not. And we don't really know what that means, but there's potential that could be pretty damaging. And, on a carnivore diet, your blood sugar is completely flat.
Yeah, I would, it's kind of interesting. Right now, the American Diabetes Association calls a fasting blood glucose over 126 diabetic. It used to be 140, which is interesting. They moved that down, and it may be that we've had this chronically metabolically inflamed people that we're seeing, the damage from glycation being amplified, and most people don't know that, but fructose is actually more glycating than glucose by maybe 10, 15 times. And so that's when we're seeing all this high fructose corn syrup. We know that not uniquely, but it can lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But I think with the, the issue, and Paul mentioned about blood glucose postprandial, if it goes up to, I'll use US units, 180, 200 regularly, that's where you're going to see the damage. And when people ask me what their glucose goal number should be, I say it should be stable, because some people will see it flat at 80, some people flat at 100. And really, I'm not too concerned about that. I'd rather see it be stable. And the CGM, continuous glucose monitor readings that I've seen on carnivore people, even type 1 diabetics, they're flat as a pancake, or flat as a ribeye, I suppose. Maybe a better analogy. But that's what we're seeing. And I think that's very, very uniquely interesting. And, whether that's the best metric or not, it's still debatable. But I think probably of the glucose numbers you can get, probably the stability is probably the most important.
So, we're sitting here on day 25 of World Carnivore Month, and I have blood work done. Now, this blood work was done about like 6 weeks ago. So it's not as accurate, lining up 100% with being as strict as I've been, because I have been eating only meat. The only plants I've had was I have had a little bit of tea here and there, and I like kratom, so I've had a little bit of that. There's been no influence of anything else other than some spices, no cheese. I cut out a lot of different things. I've been eating my liver. I've been doing all these different things. So the blood work that I get at the end of this might look a little different. But before that time, I was still eating very much carnivore, very much keto. And I just wanted to know what you guys think. As I look at these readings that I got back from my doctor, I got a couple things in the red zone. And if I didn't know, and if I didn't have great friends around me that I can, call up and ask questions to, I might be like, oh my God, I don't understand what's happening. I'm working out all the time. I'm starting to run, I'm lifting, I'm doing all these things. I'm not eating any carbs. I feel like, I feel good about what I'm doing, but it's difficult. It's challenging. It takes a lot of willpower to do it. So looking at this, I'm like, oh man, is something going on here? And so my, total cholesterol is, 226. And then the, non-HDL cholesterol is 166. And, the LDLP is, 1466. And so, these numbers and these letters and stuff don't mean a whole lot to me. The triglycerides, were in the range of 56, but, maybe you guys can help decipher some of this.
So when I see that blood work, the most important thing I'm looking at, triglyceride to HDL ratio, right? Yours is
1.
It's like 2 to 1 or something.
No, it's 1.
60 over 56. Yeah, that's
your triglycerides were 56. Your HDL is 60, so it's
Right.
less than 1, right?
Right.
That's pretty insulin sensitive. Lacking a fasting insulin or C-peptide, that's a pretty good ratio. And that's been documented in the medical literature that a triglyceride to HDL ratio is pretty good, right? So that's the thing I want to see. The LDLP is an NMR, so it's actual number of particles, and it's measured a little differently than the rest of the LDL or the rest of the cholesterol.
I do have
panel.
insulin in here somewhere.
Yeah, I want to comment on his creatinine, Paul. You see, that's 142. So, this is and I agree with Paul's assessment on the cholesterol. Your LDL is high, not surprising, but you're very insulin sensitive. Your HDL ratio to triglyceride ratio is excellent. So that's how I would look at it. And it's referred to our earlier conversation, but we see elevated creatinine, 1.42, and what their normal range is probably something 1.2 or something. What are they calling normal in here? 1.15. So we see that not infrequently in people that are ingesting higher protein diets. We see that in people that have a lot of lean muscle mass, and we see that in a lot of people that work out hard. So that elevated creatinine, many physicians would say, wait a minute, we've got a kidney problem here. If they step back and understood that calculation, and I don't know what your GFR was, but they calculate the glomerular filtration rate also based on that creatinine number. And it's assuming that your body surface area is 1.73 square meters, which you're not. You're much bigger than that. So it's assuming you're an even smaller person than you are. So these numbers are really, really not lined up to a big guy eating a lot of protein, working out. So that number is artificially inflated. But one test, and I'm sure you're aware of the cystatin C test, Paul. This is a test that does not. So this is one way we can measure kidney function through the glomerular filtration rate, the GFR, based on creatinine. But if you're on a high protein diet, those numbers are artificially inflated. It doesn't mean your kidneys aren't working. You get something called a cystatin C, which almost always in your situation would show normal or even low normal, would be my prediction. So the next time you get this test, throw in a cystatin C if you want to, if you're worried about kidney function. And not most physicians aren't aware of this. And this is something that they should. Some people are talking about it replacing creatinine because it's independent of protein intake.
My insulin is 4, by the way.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's pretty low. I mean, that's where I like to see it. It generally is 4 or less.
Where's yours at, bro?
I think it was 1.9 the last time.
What the?
See, what's interesting, when I did a debate with Lane on your podcast, I'm still salty about this. I said, Lane, what was your fasting
Lane Norton has that effect on people.
I know. I said, Lane, what was your fasting insulin? He didn't know. He was like, it was somewhere in the middle of the range. And I should have challenged him because look at the range of insulin there.
Oh, yeah.
The range of insulin.
Huge.
They're going to say it goes from 3 to 21.
Yeah.
Well, basically anything over 5 or 6, I'm starting to think this isn't right. That's a little too high. That could be insulin resistant. And certainly something in the middle of the range, 8, 9, 10, I would think of that as insulin resistant. So, Lane, I'm still calling you out, bro.
Yeah, the average American is about 8. And the average American ain't healthy.
Right.
So if we look at that.
Yeah. Like Shawn said, there's a great study looking at the metabolic health of Americans and using some pretty standard criteria, blood pressure, waist circumference, things like this. And they found that only 12% of the population in the United States was metabolically healthy.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
88% was metabolically unhealthy.
It's probably worse than that, too.
Yeah. Pretty sure you're in that group, Lane.
Right now he is. Estimated average glucose, it says it's 123. Like, why would that be high if I don't eat carbs?
So that's based on a hemoglobin A1c.
It's just a guesstimate, maybe.
Yeah. So the hemoglobin A1c is 5.9. This is actually a really important point to bring up. You can't interpret a hemoglobin A1c without a reticulocyte count because there's some good evidence that in the setting of a low carbohydrate diet, red blood cells might live longer. And you can calculate the red blood cell life with a reticulocyte count. There's kind of an esoteric formula, and I can do it for you if you want, but that might be another thing you look at. So hemoglobin A1c is a measure of the number of red blood cells that have glycated molecules or little glucose sugar molecules stuck to them. Well, you can imagine that if your red blood cells hang around your body longer, there's going to be more of them with glucose stuck to them. So hemoglobin A1c can be spuriously elevated. What was your fasting glucose, Mark?
My fasting glucose was 73.
Yeah, so it would be very unusual to see a fasting glucose of 73 and then an average blood glucose of 123. That's you'd have to have some pretty big postprandial spikes, which you probably don't have on a low carb diet. I suspect if you had a CGM, you wouldn't see your blood sugar ever go above 85 or 90 in a day, and yet your hemoglobin A1c is overestimating it because your red blood cells are probably longer lived. So if you get a reticulocyte count, you can estimate the length of time that your red blood cells are living, and you can see that they're probably living longer. So you got to add that one. That gets a little esoteric, but the take-home message is hemoglobin A1c can be spuriously elevated in people on low carbohydrate diets due to what appears to be longer residence time for red blood cells.
Yeah, you may see the biggest blood glucose spike during exercise or shortly after exercise. That's one of the things is when you're doing high intensity exercise, which you do sometimes. Yeah. Your liver will put out a little more glucose just to make it work because our body gives us what we need. And so the question about red blood cells living longer or not, that's certainly, the thought is it's a 90-day reflection, but there's stuff that shows that changes maybe more quickly than that. There's another test called fructosamine, which is another way you can kind of estimate what your blood glucose, that's supposed to be about a 2 to 3 week estimation. But again, these things are all subject to, context. If your red blood cells are living a long time, you've got high retic count, you've got all these, you got these baby red blood cells floating around, basically, you're going to have, different turnover. And, that's an important point. We put too much faith. A lot of people are going away from hemoglobin A1c as a predictor of, what our blood glucose stability. The Verta Health trial, they're seeing rapid shifts in hemoglobin A1c of, 1 or 2 points within a couple of weeks, which before we would think that wouldn't happen because it's 90 days. And it's really not. So it's not really that good of a test anymore.
You guys are awesome, man. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And, it appears to me that the diet that we're doing, the carnivore diet, it doesn't seem like it's something that's going to affect our heart in a negative way, and that's what you guys, I think, pointed out here today. So, all you people that have had all these questions about it, I really appreciate it because it gets some good dialogue going, and it gets people thinking, and it gets people maybe having deeper understandings of it. What I would suggest, though, and what I would recommend is, try to investigate and try to look into stuff a little bit. If you do simple searches on YouTube and you start to look up the carnivore diet, you're going to see Joe Rogan has a podcast. He's been on his podcast. You're going to see that he's been on my podcast a bunch of times. You're going to see that there's a lot of great information on the internet. So it'd be great if you did a little bit of your own research, dig into it rather than just saying, hey, isn't that bad for you? Maybe try to figure out a way to formulate. I think it's important in life to ask good questions, not just ask a lot of questions. So anyway, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Strength is never a weakness. Weakness is never a strength. Catch you all later.